Well, I think mine is part of it.
So the topic we're going to look at today is ancient ideas from 2,000 or more years ago about how we should flourish. How do we live the best life that we can live? Drawing on ideas from both Buddhism and ancient Greek philosophy. And the key part of the ideas from both India and Greece about what we should do is called mindfulness. And this lecture I'll focus on the meaning of mindfulness, because that's something that's been absorbed into our culture so much in the last, I don't know, 10 years or something, that now you find mindfulness in business, in education, in everyday life, in therapy, and so on. So what I want to do is to look at, well, what does it mean? And you'll see there's various meanings of it. And you can ask yourself at the end of this if any of those meanings are relevant to you in terms of the sort of life you want to live in order to flourish. Now, some of you know the first account of mindfulness was provided by someone called Gautama, who later became called the Buddha, about 500 BC. And the accounts we have of what he said that are probably closest to what he said are things called the Pali scriptures or the Pali suttas. I mean, they weren't written down immediately, they were memorized by groups of monks and then written down some 100 years later, so we don't really know what Gautama actually said about this. But the different renditions we have, some in Chinese and Pali, some in Tibet, agree in broad outline. Well, they do bear in mind that they differ in detail, so anybody who wants to get hung up on exact wording and so on, you never know if that was the original wording, if you're at all bothered about what the original wording is, which isn't necessarily a prime concern. But let's go back to as original as we can, as it were, and look at some meanings of the term mindfulness. Now, mindfulness originally wasn't defined by a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. It was really defined by giving metaphors and practices. And that painted a picture, which I think is clear enough. Within probably Gautama's lifetime, and certainly shortly afterwards, sort of a scholastic movement tried to nail down the precise meaning of the terms. I don't think that's really necessary. We can see that the sharp boundaries of mindfulness and other Buddhist concepts might be hard to place, but we see the basic idea of the sort of practice and sort of thing that it meant. So this first metaphor I take from Manileo's book. Well, it comes from a sutta, and he uses it to draw out certain properties of mindfulness. So Gautama says, just as in the last month of the hot season, when all the crops have been gathered into the village, a cowherd would look after his cows, while resting under the shade of a tree or out in the open, he simply keeps himself mindful of those cows. In the same way, I simply kept myself mindful of those mental qualities. So the idea here is looking at something in a calm way at a bit of a distance. So psychotherapy, clinical psychology type context, sort of distancing. So it's metacognitive, meaning thinking about thinking, in that you're thinking about your mental states. You're not just being drawn into them, but you're looking at your mental states as mental states at a bit of a distance. And in a calm way, as if you're a cowherd sitting on a hill, looking at your cows at a bit of a distance. So mindfulness is a calm awareness of mental states. And here's another analogy used by the Buddhist scholar Rupert Gethin. So the sutta says, imagine this scenario, a man who must pay attention to a bowl brimful of oil that he's carrying on his head. The man must do this before a crowd that has gathered to watch the most beautiful girl of the land as she dances and sings. And as the man moves between the girl and the crowd, with the bowl on his head, he's followed by another man with a drawn sword, who, if he spills so much as a drop of the oil, will cut off his head. So if you imagine yourself being in that situation, there's something about a situation is meant to be the mental attitude you're meant to have when you're being mindful. And Gethin draws out these conclusions from it. In such circumstances, it is suggested the man will pay very careful attention to the bowl of oil on his head. So part of mindfulness is paying close attention. Not being distracted by the crowd or girl. And with a similar quality of attention, the monk should cultivate mindfulness of the body. Or you extrapolate mindfulness of anything, but this was in the particular context of mindfulness of the body. So mindfulness means you hold the object in mind in a way that's indifferent to pleasure. If you pay too much attention to the dancing girl, you're going to spill that oil. Right? So you have to have a certain amount of indifference to the dancing girl. Now, it's not really drawn out in this analogy, but the indifference applies to pain as well. So the mental attitude is one of equanimity, meaning that pleasure or pain are treated in equal fashion to you. That's a specific Buddhist notion of equanimity I want to apply in this case. In other words, when there's some pleasure there, you're not drawn towards craving it or clinging to it. And pain, you're not saying, oh no, get away, I don't want this. You just say, oh, there's a pleasant sensation, there's a painful sensation. But neither of those are going to absorb my attention, especially, unless I choose to, but certainly not in a way that's sort of outside of my control, with a pleasure pulling me towards it, so then I spill the bowl of oil, or the pain making me go automatically, as it were, oh no, I don't want that, and you spill the bowl of oil. Maybe the pain in this case is the sword about to chop your head off. At least it's a fear in that case. But you have to be relatively indifferent, as it were, to that threat. So you remain calm, balancing the bowl of oil. But just because you're being, as it were, indifferent to whether it's pleasure or pain, it doesn't mean, in the original development of the idea, that you don't make judgments, that you don't pursue some things rather than other things. Because another analogy is that mindfulness is a gatekeeper at the gates to a city. And as various people come, the gatekeeper excludes some and lets others in. And it says in the sutta that the gates are, there's 6 different senses. Buddhist psychology has a somewhat, I think, to modern understanding, a slightly unusual view of the senses, and then you have the 5 senses we would normally think of as the senses, namely seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, tasting. But then the mind is regarded as something else you can sense. So the gatekeeper can let in thoughts and other sort of mental states you can have that aren't actually sensations per se. So the idea is what you're letting them into is consciousness. So you have sounds that could potentially come into consciousness, sights, smells, touches, tastes, thoughts generally understood as any mental state. And what mindfulness is a process of letting some things in, judging whether this should come in or this should not go in. Makes a judgment about that. And incidentally, this this image bears a relationship to modern theories of consciousness, in that one theory of consciousness you could draw with a diagram precisely like this, namely, consciousness is the process by which you integrate across different domains and sense modalities. The function of consciousness is to integrate information, and that's sort of what's brought out in this analogy here. Consciousness is where the things from the different senses sort of broadly come together. As another slight diversion, the other main theory we have of consciousness, and I'll talk about both of these if you do my option next term, is that consciousness is to do with awareness of mental states and mental states. And this is also brought out in the Buddha Suttas as what is what is consciousness? It's being aware of your senses, broadly construed, including thinking. So mindfulness involves judging whether the mental state that you're now beginning to sense emerging is one you should let into consciousness and sustain, or one that you don't sustain and let go. So a definition of mindfulness, bringing all of this together, is that it's the cultivation of a certain sort of awareness, namely awareness you have with equanimity, of present experience as present experience. In other words, it's metacognitive, you're seeing experience as experience, a mental state as a mental state, with a specific function of sustaining in consciousness those mental states which are relevant to your task. If you wanted, incidentally, to read up more on discussions of meaning of mindfulness, which turns out to be a topic of much discussion, then this special issue of contemporary Buddhism has lots of interesting articles. In terms of discussing the meaning that it had in the original suttas that I'm trying to bring out here, as opposed to the meaning that it has in, say, clinical psychology now. So maybe just to have some idea of what that means. Remember, mindfulness is one component in a whole set of ideas in order to get some effect, as it were, in order for this to help in your flourishing. We need to flesh out what more is going on, but I hope that sort of provides an idea of what that mindfulness component is. Now, you can get an idea of this, and it will be helpful because we'll have little goes at being mindful according to different construals of it as this lecture goes on. So for 1 minute, why don't we just try this? We'll breathe, just concentrate on your breath. And what I'd like you to do is just to sustain tension on your breath by regarding it with equanimity, anything that comes into your mind. It might be pleasant or unpleasant, what else comes into your mind. You're going to regard the pleasant or the unpleasant with complete equanimity. But there's still a judgment going on, because if something comes into your mind which isn't your breath, you judge it's not taskworthy. And then you bring your attention back to the breath. The equanimity part of that is you don't say, oh my God, my attention wandered, agree to the great disappointment, because that wouldn't be equanimity, right? You still make a judgment that this was a distraction, but you don't do so with disappointment. And if you go for the whole minute, sustaining attention on your breath, you don't get yes and feel triumph, because that wouldn't be equanimity either. Because if you allowed yourself to feel triumph, that same mental attitude would allow yourself to feel disappointment on occasions where you fail, which you inevitably will if you sustain this practice for long enough. So why don't I'll time it for exactly a minute and just focus on your breath and see if you can sustain your attention on the breath as much as you can, noticing the detail of your breath as much as you can. For example, you might notice if you're breathing through one nostril or another nostril, if the breath is warm or cold, or is it smooth or ragged, is it going in, is it going out? is a deep breath or a short breath, and so on. All right? You don't have to do this, by the way, but if you would like to give it a go, let's give it a go, starting now. Okay. I found my mind wandered quite a bit in that, even in that quite short period. One thing that helped me with that a few years ago, Jamil recommended on the Study Direct site the Coursera course by Robert Wright, and he was interpreting Buddhism through the lens of modern psychology in terms of the theory of mind having lots of modules. And those modules are always competing to control your thoughts. So if you focus on one thing, the other modules start saying, hang on a minute, I've got something really important to say. And they present thoughts, feelings, emotions to you as being really important, drawing your attention to them, because that's where the function is, to make sure we don't let something slip. You know, we're spinning lots of plates in our lives, and the reason why the modules compete with each other is to make sure we don't let something drop. So that's sort of just how we evolved. But I found that metaphor really useful, because I thought, hang on a minute, when that thought sitting there says to me, oh, so important to think about, it made me realise, no, that's just a module clamouring for attention. I don't have to think about that. Certainly not in the next minute, or 10 minutes, or half an hour, however long you're meditating for. I can certainly think about that thought later. And for me, that was the right information at the right time to then enable me to concentrate for longer. Which, incidentally, what that meant for me, I was doing something you're not meant to do, which was to count my breaths, to see how many breaths I'd go for until I was so distracted that I lost count. And I was getting up, well, I was finding it difficult to get to 30. Wasn't that I didn't think of anything else for the 30, but I had enough attention on the breath to know what count I was on until about 30, and then I was so distracted that I had no idea what the count was. But then just thinking about that one little thing about the modular mind, I could get to 300, knowing what count I was on. Again, I wasn't saying that I wasn't being distracted, but simply had enough attention on the breath to know what count I was on. So that was a step change for me, but bear in mind, counting is regarded in the Buddhist canon as the beginning step before you start properly meditating. So that was a step change on the beginning step to starting meditating. In fact, at that point, I then dropped that crutch. So there's going to be a lot of practices in meditating which are useful for you for a time, but then once you achieve the purpose, you drop them and you try something else. So then I stopped counting and found I had a different quality of attention just by being as non-verbal as possible, concentrating on the breath. Now let's take the way mindfulness is defined typically in, you could say, the secular context, with the modern way it's used in clinical psychology and all sorts of other contexts. mindfulness, one of the reasons mindfulness is such a big part of psychology now is because of John Kabat-Zinn, who introduced the mindfulness-based stress reduction in the BSR course, I think in the 1970s, as a way of dealing with stress and pain. His definition was mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Now, I think that's you see the relationship to what we've been talking about. It's looking at what's going on in your mind right now, non-judgmentally. Well, I suppose the non-judgmentally corresponds to what I was talking about, equanimity, the indifference to pleasure and pain. But there's a couple of meanings of non-judgmental. If you say a person's non-judgmental, you sort of mean that they don't go around blaming people. But non-judgmentally, literally speaking, might mean you don't make any judgments. So let's see how this might go. Let's say you're concentrating on your breath and you think, I'm angry at Freddie. So if you're following this definition, you might say, okay, I've just got to accept that thought non-judgmentally. And then you might have the thought, it's good to be angry because it means no one will mess with me. Okay? Accept that thought non-judgmentally. So you accept it's good to be angry? So remember, you could accept a sensation as being there, that's one thing. But when you accept a thought as being there, you're accepting yourself as being in a state of being committed to a certain sort of claim. In other words, you're accepting yourself being committed to a certain sort of claim. In other words, you're accepting a certain sort of claim. So you're going to accept it's good to be angry? We can sort of play a typical philosopher's trick and get a paradox out of this. You might have a thought, I won't non-judgmentally accept the instruction to be non-judgmental. So do you accept one will be judgmental? So I think the definition of being non-judgmental, even though you see it occur over and over again in the current definitions of mindfulness, I'm not especially happy with it as a definition of mindfulness. But I also think John Kabat-Zinn is a highly experienced meditator and knows a lot more about Buddhism than I do. He's drawing on a Zen tradition of mindfulness, where they do say this sort of thing. You're going to be non-judgmental, and you cultivate the art of non-doing, which is something else Kabat-Zinn says. This is also part of Tibetan traditions, these sorts of notions as well. But remember, Zen relished paradox. Zen doesn't try and give a formal account of what it's about. It's precisely doing the opposite. It's trying to play with your mind, to confuse you, to lead you into paradox, so you give up conceptual thinking. I don't think that's sort of the basis necessarily that we want to formalize our understanding of mindfulness, and is, as I say, different from the original Pali accounts, where you do make judgments. That was part of the gatekeeper that opens the gates or not. Nonetheless, having said all that, I think the recommendation to be non-judgmental, it should be taken as not as a formal account of mindfulness, but as a particular practice that you can do that can be useful. Like I said before, sometimes it's useful to engage in a practice that you then throw away when it's had its use. You might come back to it, but you can do other practices. In other words, as a psychological attitude you can have, being non-judgmental is actually quite useful sometimes. So we could try that for 30 seconds. What I'd like you to do is focus on your breath again. Then whatever comes into your mind, I want you to non-judgmentally accept it. And just see how you find that as a practice. I lost track of time last time, so I won't actually do it myself, but I'll just time it for 30 seconds. So if you'd like to try that, see if you can engage in a practice of being non-judgmental about your mental states as you concentrate on your breath. Okay, go. Okay. So no, I find, I didn't try it in that precise 30 seconds, very quickly, that it is sometimes helpful to cultivate that attitude of being non-judgmental. But you have to bear at the back of your mind that mindfulness is essentially a process of choosing to sustain attention on one thing rather than another. That's making a judgment. So the non-judgmental aspect of it shouldn't be taken too literally. As I said, Kabat-Zinn, drawing on a Zen tradition, and also part of Tibetan traditions, Tibetan traditions, Wudra and Dzogchen, of non-judging, non-doing. I just contrast this with another account from the suttas, the Pali accounts. Suppose that a man were wounded with an arrow thickly smeared with poison. His friends and companions, kinsmen and relatives would provide him with a surgeon. The surgeon would cut around the opening of the wound with a knife and probe with the arrow with a probe. He then would pull out the arrow and extract the poison, leaving no residue behind. So the Pali account continues. The meaning is this: the wound stands for the 6 internal sense media. In other words, it's your senses and your thoughts that are going to bring into your mind the following poisons: ignorance and craving. I'll come to them. The probe is mindfulness, and the knife is discernment, distinguishing skillful from unskillful mental states and sensations. So what Anileo draws from this is mindfulness as a probing quality. It's looking for information so that you can do something with it later. So what do you do? Well, one thing you do is you can look at the sensations and the thoughts coming in. And incidentally, certainly in terms of modern psychology, we can think of it, say, a sight as going through, or a smell as going through several layers of processing, where you're building up from something basic, building up more abstract, and so on. And at a certain point, feelings enter into that processing. Now, from a Buddhist perspective, one time for meditation that I found very useful is just to note the feelings that occur. So just note whether they're pleasant, they're unpleasant, or neutral. Every feeling. I just concentrate on whatever's happening in my mind. Is it pleasant? Is it unpleasant? Is it neutral? And note, when did that arise, that feeling? When does it pass? And what does it lead to? And this is one of the crucial things that you do with meditation. You see, what does that feeling lead to? So you have a pleasant feeling somewhere in my body, pleasant thought. But then what happens in my mind? Am I craving for something? Am I wanting something? Am I clinging to something? When unpleasant thought or feeling, does that make me bring about aversion in me and pushing away? So what you're aiming to do in this meditation is to note that process as happening, and then what you're going to do is sustain certain sorts of mental states, which are the ones you want to cultivate, and let the other ones drop away. You let yourself have the pleasant sensation, for example, while not responding to any craving or clinging, and hopefully that fading away. Now, if it doesn't fade, then the Pali scriptures give you various mental activities to help you make it fade. For example, if you found ill will arising in you, you could engage in love and kindness meditation, say towards the person to whom you feel ill will. You do things to change the mental states in your mind, to cultivate them to be more like the ones that you actually want to have. There's a doing thing. Now, as I said before, in one of the modern theories of consciousness, the function of consciousness is to integrate across domains. And so, you imagine we're integrating, and we end up having accounts drawing together on all of those sense experiences and mental experiences. And we can think of these accounts as occurring over different time periods. So over a somewhat lengthy time period, this might be the narrative that you're telling yourself. I am buying and eating that muffin I craved. I will finally be satisfied. And there's a smaller time scale. I'm eating part of that muffin. Finally, I'll be happy. But then you can focus your attention, or allow into your consciousness. You can bring your consciousness further and further back down these levels of processing here. So you're focusing on what's happening right now. What is the actual sensation, pleasant or unpleasant, you're getting from this muffin right now in your mouth? What are the textures, the feelings that you're getting? So now one function of mindfulness is to go down as far as you can to right now. Holding something in mind right now. Now why do you want to do this? Because according to the Buddhist analysis, we're all subject to an illusion that we can probably recognize as trivially true at an intellectual level, but we haven't yet changed, but we're still experientially influenced by it. The illusion is the following, and we can completely understand it from an evolutionary perspective, why evolution would make us feel this way. Evolution would make us feel, if only we got that next thing, finally we would be happy. Now, wouldn't that be great if we got that? And then, somehow in the back of the mind, there's a sense of lasting happiness and contentment. If only we ate that muffin, or we got that car, or we changed our boyfriend, or whatever it is. Somehow in your mind, there's this sort of presumption that, and then I'll be happy for the rest of my life. Of course, when you spell it out like that, you intellectually know that it's ridiculous. But what you have to do is to focus experientially on what's happening right now to see how that is part of the illusion of every desire that we have that makes us see the world that way. If only we got the next thing. The reason why evolution made us this way, kept us running on the hedonic treadmill, is if we think that next thing will finally be the answer, we'll run like buggery to get it. But then evolution's got to make sure, of course we won't be satisfied with that, because if you're just satisfied, you wouldn't do anything else, right? So almost as soon as you've got it, it's almost in that moment no longer good enough, and you're already thinking of the next thing that you need. If only you had that, then you'd be happy. If only this muffin was a bit sweet or a bit less sweet, if only it was a bit bigger, etc. You know, this experience is fine, I guess, but it could be better, right? That's how we're designed to operate. So that's the illusion that keeps us unhappy, because we live constantly deluded. And the way to break that illusion is to focus our attention right down here, stopping the narrative at the highest level, which may well be on certain models we currently have, like predictive coding, of how the brain works. The theories we have at the top feed down and change the theories we have lower down, which feed down and change the theories we have lower down, and feed down and change the representations, interpretations we have lower down, and so on. So our delusions may infect us right down to certain basic levels of perception. So what you're trying to do in meditation is to undo that process, and to change the way we see the world. So we are deceived by experience of the world. We crave that which will never satisfy, but somehow we implicitly believe it will. So, and part of that delusion is thinking, if only this were mine, or this were me even, we want to identify with it, or only this were not mine, I got rid of this, this was far from me. So as Al-Bahari spells out the Buddhist notion, we construct a boundary between self and not self. And you want to move in here the things that are me, mine, forever. That's the implicit presumption, even if we intellectually know it false. And push out with ill will and aversion forever anything that we don't like. So we construct a boundary. But it's an illusionary boundary, because there isn't really a boundary between self and non-self. There is nothing really that defines it. It seems to be certain places, depending on context. Is it your skin? You see, that's a certain boundary between self and non-self. Well, chop off an arm, you're still yourself. You say, yeah, I'm still myself. Okay. We can move the boundary ever inwards. And in the Buddhist analysis, what you're trying to do is you move the boundary in until it becomes a point and vanishes, and then you realise, actually, there is nothing that's the self. There is no essential unchanging core that defines me and to which I can identify things for me forever. If you just let go of the burden, break down the walls, then you would feel a certain joy, which is the joy that comes from constant mindfulness practice.
Yes. So the point is to get rid of the boundary.
Yes. Yes. That's why Buddhism identifies with the notion of, it distinguishes itself from the other Indian philosophies by saying it's a philosophy of not self.
Okay.
You realise there's not a self. So that's the project of Buddhist mindfulness as I understand it. Now, a big part of this is becoming indifferent to pleasure and pain. Now, you can ask yourself, as I ask myself, do I want to become indifferent to pleasure? Or do I like savouring pleasure? Do I not like savouring that muffin? Do I really want to give that up? Well, the sutta, the Pali account of this is, imagine some lepers, and they get relief by burning their wounds in the fire. Then, oh yeah, that feels good. But the relief is so temporary, and only moments later they'll need to do it again. Now imagine one of those lepers gets better, and he looks at the other lepers there burning themselves. Would he want to go back and become like them to get the pleasure of that fire burning the wounds? That is what it's like when you get the pleasure from the senses, is the argument. Well, I still think I'm one of those guys in there. So that's the Buddhist account of mindfulness. Now I want to move on to an account that is strikingly similar, that originated around about 300 BC, starting, well, this particular account, the Stoics, starting with Zeno of Citium or Citium. Stoa stands for a column, because Zeno would teach in an area with a lot of columns there, so it's called Stoics. In those days, these columns would be brightly painted in Athens with gods and so on. So one way of approaching Stoicism is the theory of emotions. According to the theory, the world gives you certain impressions that present themselves in part as propositions or judgments about the world, to which you can assent to, agree to, or not agree to. Now, the judgments are often about things external to yourself that we seem to care about, like possessions, reputation, health, and so on. Now, according to the Stoics, these things are not actually necessary in any way for your happiness and flourishing. We think that they are, but they're not. So when you make a judgment about one of these externals being greatly important to you, like you really want one, or you're very sad, upset that you didn't get one, that's what they call the passion. And that's why life is effectively miserable, is because we're conditioning our happiness on externals which are beyond our control, and also not actually at all necessary for living the good life. Okay. So one reason for getting rid of passions is their delusions. Our mind presents, say, the muffin to us as being extremely valuable and essential to our happiness. If only we get that. Well, that's not true at all. Not when you trained your mind the right way. So there's an object in the world. It presents to us an impression, together with the claim, like muffins are one of the goods on which flourishing depends. I'll eat this good. Now you have the choice to assent to, agree to that judgment or not. And when you agree to it, that is the fully fledged emotion. Then. So in this case, if you agree to that, the emotion could be an excited looking forward to the eating of the muffin.
Sorry.
Yes.
Can you go back to the slide with the passion film?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So now this is a delusion because flourishing life does not depend on that muffin in any way. It doesn't depend on any external thing in any way. We just believe that it does, and that creates these volatile and intense passions. And although they can feel good sometimes, the only way you get happiness from, say, a muffin is making yourself susceptible to the despair and disappointment that comes, the bitter tears, when someone takes that muffin away from you. Okay? So if you're putting yourself in a position where you can be happy with the externals, you're putting yourself in a position where you can be miserable. And because life is like that, you will be miserable sooner or later, because that's just how the universe is. You don't always get the muffins that you want. So methods for eliminating passions. First of all, be constantly mindful of impressions. So take this metacognitive stance, looking at the impressions that are there and judging, is it, I know this is presenting something to me as valuable, but is it really valuable? So you're putting some distance between you and these mental states in order to reconsider them. So the sort of thing you would assent to, and the sort of judgment you're trying to change yourself to have, is the muffin is merely food. I will eat it, Zeus willing. The Zeus willing bit, you could say the universe willing, or if it turns out that way, meaning I'll try and eat it, but if the universe is so set up that Bill is going to take that muffin and I don't have it, well, so be it. So Epictetus, who was a slave, who learned Stoicism from a famous Stoic teacher at the time, became so famous as a teacher. In his freedom, he even had emperors coming to see him. He says this: so make a practice at once of saying to every strong impression, an impression is all you are, not the source of the impression. In other words, you're presenting this muffin as valuable, but you're not the muffin itself. The muffin in itself isn't valuable. The impression is not the thing itself. Then test and assess it with your criteria. The one primarily asks, is this something that is or is not in my control? Now, according to Epictetus, the only things in your control, really in your control, is your ability to assent to a judgment or an intention, to agree with the judgment or not. That's the only thing in your control. So those are the only things you're going to predicate your happiness. Everything else is not your concern. So I said to you guys, tomorrow you're going to give little talks in the threes, and you might have the desire that your talk promoting functionalism will be so persuasive that, I don't know, the two other people in the group will say, yeah, brilliant, you persuaded me, that was fantastic. But that is not in your control. So according to Epictetus, that isn't an intention you would formulate. What you would do is you would say, I'll do my best to be persuasive, but if they're persuaded or not, well, that's the will of Zeus. Meaning Zeus is the universe. So confine your desires and aversions only to that which you can control, which is, in other words, intending and doing your best. So now, how do you go about decreasing the things present themselves as valuable, which are not? Which are presented with illusions, as it were. How do we help overcome these illusions? In everything which pleases or supplies the want or is loved, remember to add this to your mental description of it. What is the nature of each thing, beginning from the smallest? If you love an earthen vessel, say it is an earthen vessel which you love. So you wouldn't say, oh, this is a magnificent Ming Dynasty cup that my great-great-grandfather had, which is intensely valuable family possession. You just say, it's a bit of clay. It's painted blue. Then when your friend accidentally breaks it and smashes it into pieces, you say, that bit of clay is broken. When giving your wife or child a kiss, repeat to yourself, I'm kissing a mortal. So remember, everyone is mortal, including your children, loved ones, parents, and so on. So you're preparing for the inevitability of the death at some point. And apply this to other people. So if someone seems drunk and out of control, someone drinks a lot of wine. Don't say he drinks badly, but just say, oh, he's drunk a lot. So try and take out the value judgments when you see other people and just describe the facts that are in front of you. So now this brings us then to the second step, which we've already gotten into. So the first one was being aware of your mental states, the impressions, and evaluating them properly. The other aspect, which we've already come to, is being mindful of the world, of the here and now, of objects, not just mental states, but to see the world as it is. And one aspect of Stoic philosophy is different to Buddhism, is they thought the world is predetermined. They believe in determinism. There are causal laws in the universe that run on. So just so you accept what's happened as that's the way it had to be. So this is what Seneca says. Foresight, our ability to see into the future, the greatest blessing humanity has been given, is transformed into a curse. Wild animals run from the dangers they actually see. Once they have escaped from them, they worry no more. We, however, are tormented alike by what is past and what is to come. Constantly thinking about the past and the future. But no one confines his unhappiness to the present. If you look at what's happening in the present, it's rarely as bad as all that, as the picture we're painting when we're imagining the past and the future. He says, I look with stupefaction. I look at the world as though I was seeing it for the first time. So this is what you might call mindfulness of the world, to see the world as it is right now, without being coloured by the big picture. Like when I was talking about the Buddhism, these long narratives we have, just see it as it is right now. But there is bad stuff happening in the world, there is adversity, there is stuff happening that you don't like, so how are you going to deal with that? Well, Seneca says there must be adversity as a means for training ourselves. Because otherwise you'll just be spoiled, right, if everything went your own way. You have no mental resources. So no one is more unhappy than one who has never met with adversity. So to triumph over the disasters of mortal life is the privilege of a great person. So when bad stuff happens, Seneca is advising, is you do pay attention to the present and you say, this is fantastic, because now I have a chance to practice equanimity, braveness, kindness in the face of this ordeal. And if I never had this ordeal, which the universe is sure to provide us with, I'd never be able to train the greatness of my character, my ability to be kind, generous, equanimous, in the face of whatever happens. Marcus Aurelius, one of the emperors and famous Stoics, suggested likewise that we break down events that are happening into the basic components to sort of strip them of their magic enchantment that they seem to have, which is just an illusion. So even in the case of sexual intercourse, it is just the rubbing together of abdomens following a convulsion, the expulsion of sticky liquid. So, on the one hand, what you're doing is analysing something very locally to see factual details just as they are. But the other thing Marcus Aurelius suggests is we see things very globally. If we're suddenly raised aloft and looked at human affairs from above in all their diversity, with what contempt would you view them? Seeing at the same time what a host of heavenly bodies are all around in the ether. So, this has been described as the view from above, where we see the grandeur of the universe, and it has been argued this is one of the joys that come from Stoicism, is seeing the joy of the really big picture, how magnificent the universe is. But if you look at this, part of this is about, it's not just the joy of the big picture, it's about making our pleasures and triumphs seem minuscule. So the thought I want to leave you with now is, both the Buddhist and the Stoic perspective, there's a lot about becoming indifferent to pleasures. And I just want to present now another notion to wrap up with of mindfulness, which was developed just before the Stoics, in fact, starting with Aristippus, who was a student of Socrates. Another student of Socrates became founded a movement called the Cynics, which is sort of the opposite of these guys, which then led into the Stoics. So they have a common grandfather in the form of Socrates. Well, Aristippus was a hedonist. He said, always make good use of whatever happened, for he enjoyed the pleasure of whatever was present, and didn't hunt painfully for the enjoyment of what wasn't present. He did not value any particular pleasure, so much he would trouble himself if it was not available. When his attendant was carrying his silver, he was very rich, on the road, and was struggling with the wage, Aristippus said, pour off some of that silver and carry what you can. So although Aristippus enjoyed pleasure in the moment, he didn't cling to anything. He wasn't striving for or craving a pleasure in the future. He was just enjoying the pleasure in the moment. So he told people to keep their attention on the day, then in turn on that part of the day in which each is thinking and doing something. For he always said that only what is present is ours, neither what has already come nor what is still anticipated. For one has perished and is uncertain of any other will happen. There's a similar thought to Seneca, but what Aristippus is saying, think about the pleasure you're having right now and savour it, because that's the real enjoyment of life, that's the good life, that's flourishing. And this is a completely different notion of mindfulness than the one I've developed from the Buddhist and the Stoic perspective. So maybe we'll just finish with 30 seconds now. What I'd like you to do is just consider all the experiences you're having right now, consider the ones that are pleasurable, and just enjoy the pleasure of that experience that's happening right now without clinging to it or looking for anything in the future or anything in the past. Okay, go. That's a little exercise I give my son, by the way, and I do myself. Because I often find in any moment, there's always actually quite a number of things that I find pleasant and pleasurable. So those are various notions of mindfulness. So you consider for yourself which, in any of those ways, would you like to cultivate to be more mindful in your life. Okay, thanks.